Hi, welcome to the Divine Insight Show. Thank you so much for joining wherever you're doing so. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by an incredible guest, Dr. Loretta Breuning, who is here with me. Loretta, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Hi, great to be here.
And you're the founder, just for folks who maybe not have heard of you yet, you're the founder of Inner Mammal Institute, which helps people manage the ups and downs of their mammal brain. You learned that our happy brain chemicals swing up and down because they have a job to do. I'm thrilled to talk to you more about that today. And you've shared that when you know what they do in animals, you can make peace with your own inner mammal. And we're going to talk about one of your books primarily, though you've authored so many, Habits of a Healthy Brain. Retrain your brain.
Excuse me, habits of a happy brain.
Oh, so I'm sorry, healthy brain.
Everyone does that.
Everyone, thank you so much. Habits of a happy brain, thank you. Retrain your brain to boost your serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphin levels. The science of positivity, stop negative thought patterns by changing your brain chemistry. And finally, I, Mammal, how to make peace with the animal urge for social power. So thanks again so much for joining me today. I'm thrilled to talk more about your work, this book, and to share your wisdom and insights with viewers and listeners.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you're so welcome. So I'm always fascinated with how people get started in the work that they do. And so I want to ask you, how did you get started in studying and understanding the correlation between animal and human brains and happiness?
So you could say there's the conscious path and the unconscious path. So the conscious path is I was a professor of management for 25 years and also a parent. And that's a dog in the background. And I was frustrated that my students were not especially motivated and my kids were not especially motivated and the kids of other professors were not especially motivated. So I thought our theories of motivation are not working for us and what else can I learn? So I took early retirement and I started studying more and especially learned about the animal brain and the brain chemicals that we share with animals and that are so obviously the cause of the motivations that help animals meet their survival needs. So that's the whole conscious part. Then the unconscious part is I grew up in a very unhappy home, and like so many people, I was always trying to understand like what's behind all this unhappiness. And so I was always a big reader of psychology, and over the years new branches of psychology developed and I always kept in touch with it. But because that was like an unconscious interest, I wasn't doing it in the academic way. And I think that left me the freedom to just go with what feels true to me rather than what is officially smiled upon, and therefore I was able to connect the dots among many different silos, which academics generally don't do.
Yeah, and so what about animals? How did you start doing more work with animals and understanding their brains?
So I didn't do direct research, but I discovered other people's research. And as much as we like to hear, well, the latest studies say this and that, in fact, 100-year-old studies and a whole century of accumulation of these studies is what I discovered. And I was shocked, like, how come I've been in the social sciences all these years and never heard about this? And the reason is because it's not nice, because animals have motivations that are not nice. And the currently fashionable view is to represent animals as nice and to represent traditional indigenous people as always only nice. And so all not nice impulses come from our society. But the reality is that not only do animals have not nice impulses, but the brain actually rewards you with happy chemicals when you assert yourself to meet your survival needs. And that's what we're always struggling to manage, this core operating system.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And as far as the survival needs, I know that you talk about that in the development of your work and everything. So can you talk about the brain's survival needs in our evolution and how is that meaningful for us to understand how that works today?
So first, there's the need for food and shelter. I mean, food and safety and the obvious thing. And then a lot of people today have heard like there's social needs. But from an animal perspective, we can understand the social needs more clearly. So first, reproduction. Like, we are not consciously trying to spread our genes all the time. But what I learned from evolutionary psychology is that animals do things that spread their genes because natural selection built a brain that rewards you with good feelings when you do things that spread your genes. But what does spread your genes mean? It's not just the obvious sex act, but it's attracting partners and nurturing children and building social alliances that help your children stay alive so that they have children, and that's what keeps your genes alive. And that's what our brains reward us for.
Interesting. So you're reminding me, I just saw this video of these two male lions. I don't know if you've seen this very recently, then the studies of like the gay penguins and the lions, the sort of, if you will, homosexuality of the mammal species. I'm interested in, I guess, on sort of maybe even a side note in that, because is there some similarity in the reproductive need or something in the brain for those who are, you know, not wired for reproduction specifically, but maybe who gay, that when you're gay, that's not something that is specifically for reproduction, although many people obviously have kids and nurture them and all of that stuff. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, we're all sort of a mix and match of traits. And there is this theory in evolutionary psychology called group selection, which means behaviors that improve the bonding of the group, which implies the group's ability to protect itself from external threats, so more genes survive. And so it started with the idea of, why would you invest in your nieces and nephews? Because that is helping your genes to survive. So,
I see.
And when you invest in your cousins, it's because helping your genes survive. And they actually do the math where they say, if you invest in 4 cousins, that's like investing in 1 child, because 4 cousins has the same, you know, if your cousins are 1/4 related to you, so 4 of them, helping 4 cousins is equal to helping one of your children. So if you invest in something to help 6 of your cousins, you know, so that's the idea of group selection. So that could be part of it. And there's a lot of different views. And sometimes I'm a little suspicious of them because they do come from an agenda where people are actively trying to filter evidence to support a specific view. But with that caveat, you may have heard about bonobos, who are known for sexually stimulating each other all the time, not in a reproductive capacity, but in the same sex, intergenerational, blah, blah, blah. And on the one hand, I think, yeah, maybe this is a little exaggerated, but what I really focus on is, like, in the state of nature, it's not love. Animals are trying to negotiate reciprocal alliances. So I'll be nice to you if you're nice to me is always the thing. And sometimes you groom an individual's fur and they groom your fur back. Sometimes you groom their fur and they protect you when you're attacked by a predator. Sometimes you protect them when they're attacked by a predator and they don't protect you back. So the animal mind is always sort of tallying this reciprocal, like, what's good for my survival and how can I help you so that you help me? And there's just infinite ways to do that. And I'm not saying that it's hardwired, because each brain wires itself from experience, but the impulses that help us feel good and bad about these experiences that build the pathways are at the core inherited from animals.
I see. So I guess as I would relate it to your discussion in your book that we're going to talk a little bit more about, the neurochemical and the chemical pathways that support the happiness of a brain would exist with that type of partnering, if you will, regardless of the gender, if you will, of the partner, so long as the needs are met in the ways that you've described. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. And it's like we're all trying to build mutual alliances in whatever ways we can, in whatever ways worked for us in our past, because that's how the brain seeks rewards, is whatever worked for you in the past built neural pathways that tell you to seek more of that.
Interesting. So can you talk a little bit about those neural pathways and how those work?
Sure. So this is one of the things that really amazed me. Again, like, how come I hadn't heard more of that? So the brain chemicals that make us feel good or bad are the animal brain signal, like, this is important to your survival. So our brain is not designed for feeling good. It's designed for survival. So when I have a happy brain, chemical and I feel good, that's my brain signal, like, this meets your survival needs, get more of it. And that helps build connections between neurons. And that's how, like, a little monkey learns to find food, because the food feels good and any neurons activated at that time, they start to connect, and that tells the monkey how to find food without like a formal education program,
No.
without even language. So that's how it works. Now, why these neural pathways are so powerful is another big part of it. So we're all born with billions of neurons, but no connections between them, almost none. So other animals are built with a lot of connections, but the bigger the brain, the less wired it is at birth. And that's why humans take so long to function independently, whereas animals function independently very quickly. And again, my book goes into a lot more detail, but the idea is that the electricity in your brain flows effortlessly down the pathways that you built up big when you were young. And we have all these billions of other pathways, but it's really hard to activate them. So we tend not to use them because it's so hard to activate them that you have to stop whatever else you're doing to get them going. So the other pathways, we call it autopilot because electricity flows there effortlessly. So then you could just keep doing whatever.
Right. So from a chemical standpoint, where does happiness come from?
So I focus on 4 chemicals: dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphin. And my website has like a jillion different explanations of how they work, in whatever format you like to get your information. But I'd be happy to go into more detail on them if you want.
Right. Yeah, I was just more curious, I suppose, in how they work, maybe, than specifically. I mean, and what I really appreciated, by the way, in your book was that you go through a detailed, even a worksheet, sort of something that people can use on their own to get more understanding, and also apply the principles of these chemicals, which I found just fascinating, into their own lives. So I really encourage folks to get the book and take a look at it, because they really make more meaningful sort of the emotional element of these types of these chemicals, and I'll obviously ask you a little bit more right now, or in a few moments, about maybe some different ways that they can create new pathways that people can. But I'm curious, how do these chemicals work?
How do they work? So our brain is always flooded with more information than we can take in. So it comes into your senses and you have to filter it. We don't have a choice. And even animals, like as they walk through the forest, if they took in every detail, then they couldn't make sense of anything. So they're scanning for, what do I see that's relevant to my survival? So that's how, like, a monkey will see a piece of fruit in the distance, and it zooms in on that piece of fruit because past experience with that fruit said, yum, delicious, this meets my needs. And once that happens, dopamine is stimulated, because dopamine is the feeling of this meets my needs. And dopamine builds neural pathways connecting all the circuits active at that moment, which is that seeing the piece of fruit. So dopamine feels good and it motivates action. So that's what motivates the monkey to step toward the fruit. And each step closer to the fruit stimulates more dopamine, which is what motivates us all to take that action to meet our needs. Once the monkey finally gets the fruit, the dopamine stops, and that's because it has already done its job. The monkey has now met its needs, has some time to rest and digest, and after a while, it will get hungry again, and then it will be like, oh, I better look for something that meets my needs, and the whole cycle starts over. So this is why you mentioned in the beginning how, ups and downs are natural. We're not designed to just effortlessly coast while sitting on the couch.
I think that's fascinating because I think, a lot of people understand the laws of attraction and that we're trying to attract the things that we want in our life, but we often forget that step of taking the action that is inspired in some way. So I think that's really useful for people to, you gave the example of dopamine, although for the other neurochemicals you described for serotonin and oxytocin, you have examples of what they are useful for and how people, where they come from and all of that. But I really want to explore a little bit about what you talked about, because I think it is so important that when you talk about unhappy chemicals, you talk about how those are just as essential for our survival as happy ones. And I think of the example also of emotions. We have happy emotions and we have unhappy emotions. And a lot of people think they are doing something wrong when they have an unhappy emotion. Like, shouldn't I be better at life could I just not get angry? Right? Then they think they're screwing up. And I want to really encourage people to understand, and I think you hit this home in the neurochemical discussion, is that these are essential just as much as happy ones. They're a part of us. And so we want to honor them and understand them and maybe not wallow in them, but to learn how to, move forward. So with that being said, all of that, can you explain why unhappy chemicals are just as essential as happy ones?
Sure. And by the way, I have a new book called Tame Your Anxiety, Rewiring Your Brain for Happiness. And like the first page starts right here. And also the science of positivity is about why it's natural to go negative and why we have to actually work to feel positive. So unhappy chemicals are the brain signal that you're in immediate danger of a survival threat. Now, in the modern world, we don't feel like we're about to be eaten by predators or starved to death. But because we haven't had those extreme threats, then the same chemical, cortisol, that evolved to warn an animal of extreme threat, we use that for whatever smaller threats we face, because that's how the brain works. So the smaller threat of, let's say, not getting invited to a party, or studying for a test and not doing well. Disappointment is cortisol, because if you imagine that a lion is running after a gazelle and the gazelle gets away, when the gazelle gets away, that's a survival threat for a lion because
I
going to
see.
starve. So
Right.
Disappointment has a healthy natural function, which is disappointment tells the lion, stop chasing this gazelle, because if you chase one that got away, you're just wasting your energy, and then you're never going to get anything, because a lion can't catch anything unless it has its full force. So it has to really make careful decisions about wasting its energy. So we all hate to waste our energy. We all hate to try for something and then fail. Now, worse things could happen. But if you live a pretty safe life, then really that's kind of like the worst that happens. So that's one whole reason why. So another whole reason why is because, as I mentioned, after you get the fruit, the dopamine stops. So then when your happy chemicals stop, they stop masking the cortisol that you already have. And the cortisol you already have, I just in the interest of time to say, it's like your awareness of your mortality. The clock is always ticking. You're not going to live forever. Your body's wearing out. And like we know this with our human brain, but the animal brain is focused on survival, and animals don't think about the future. So when you plug the human brain into the animal brain, you get this brain that terrorizes itself with its own thoughts about the future. And that triggers our cortisol. And then we try to mask that cortisol by doing something fun, by doing something happy, by stimulating happy chemicals. But then every happy chemical is metabolized in a few minutes, which is why we're always looking for ways to keep stimulating them.
That's really fascinating. I was caught a little bit what you talked about, the survival threat. And the fact that since we don't have the same types of survival threat that animals had, or even that we had, years and years and years ago, we're living longer, and we're
We're
not
not
going to be
invaded by our neighbors who steal our grain, and we're going to go hungry till next harvest season.
right. We don't have to go hunting for animals. We have to go to the grocery store. So can you talk about the types of survival threats and maybe what can show up? I think you already gave a couple of examples, but what is a survival threat and how does that apply to our lives now?
So the way your brain works is anything that triggered your cortisol in the past paved pathways that trigger your cortisol today. So you define as a threat anything that triggered your cortisol in the past. So one person defines one way and it's not just what your verbal brain defines, but anything that turns on that cortisol pathway.
I see.
Now, your brain is designed to prioritize cortisol, which means if a gazelle is enjoying its lunch, but it smells a predator, it would rather keep eating lunch. So the only way it can run is if cortisol makes it feel so bad that it stops eating and runs. So that's what happens with us, is cortisol makes us feel so bad that we can't think about other things. And that's sort of where why we react to it. And the other thing that we all have in common is we're all born helpless. So when a baby is hungry, it feels a survival need, but it can't meet it. So it's dependent on others to meet our needs. And every child has that moment where you so urgently want others to meet your needs and they don't. So we all build these cortisol circuits when we're young, and then we react to them until we understand our reactions and redirect ourselves.
Thanks. And is there any way to rewire these neural pathways?
Yes, so that's the conclusion of all of my books. So it's not easy, and in one word, it takes a lot of repetition. So our old pathways built effortlessly because we have a lot of neuroplasticity when we're young, but after adolescent, it takes a huge amount of repetition. And most people don't want to do the repetition because why would you repeat something that doesn't feel good when you already have this circuit that your brain thinks is better for your survival? So when you repeat the new behavior, you actually feel like you're doing something bad for your survival, even though your conscious verbal brain knows it's good. But if you know how your brain works, then you just say, if I repeat this for 45 days, then I will build a new pathway and then it will start to feel good and then it will feel natural and easier. And it's exactly like the difference between speaking your native language versus learning a foreign language. That your native language took a lot of work to learn that, but you don't know that because the pathways are there now. But a new language, you have to work really hard to learn it, and yet in theory you know it's possible, you just haven't done the work.
Oh, that's really interesting. And there's so many applications that I see this as happening, when people, negative patterning, negative self-talk, addictions, things that are quick fixes to get that dopamine fix, if you will, that show up in so many different ways in our lives: food, alcohol, drugs, negative, all these patterns. So it's really fascinating to know that you can actually, with effort, because as you described how that works, can actually change your brain, which is fascinating. So I really appreciate that. How did you develop the exercises to do that you have in your book?
So each one is focused on a specific chemical. So exercises that you could do for dopamine, for serotonin, oxytocin. That's one thing. The other is I tried to develop as many as I could because when you build on pathways you already have, when you build on the foundations of your myelinated circuits that you built when you were young, it comes so much more easily. So instead of having some right way to do everything, I try to give people options that can feel closer to what's natural to you.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. I'd love to learn more about your Inner Mammal Institute. Can you share more about it, what its purpose is, and how they help people?
Sure. So the idea is to provide resources that help people make peace with their inner mammal, and to provide resources in all the different possible ways that people like them. So some people like to read and some people don't, and all different forms of information, and to make it short, long, funny, serious, and it's mostly just me and people who cooperate with me on specific projects.
Awesome. Thank you. So, is there anything else that you'd like to add about your work or the brain that we haven't already talked about?
Yes, small steps are the answer. So when you talked about, people that want to have positive images, law of attraction, whatever, we're all trained to dream big, and then people get disappointed and frustrated because between the top of the mountain and where you are now, it's the steps to get there that are frustrating. And so I learned something amazing from a guy who bicycles up this mountain near my home. And he told me he divides the mountain into four quarters, and he knows when he's arrived at each quarter, and he celebrates each milestone in his mind. And I thought that was so strange because the mountain is just as high, but psychologically, when you have an awareness of your progress, you stimulate dopamine. So the challenge for us is always to divide our goals into small steps and take them frequently. And then you get the dopamine from each step, and then that builds the dopamine pathway, and then you expect that your steps to work. So like you expect to reach the next milestone, and then you start getting excited in advance because the dopamine is already flowing. So really breaking your work down into small steps that you can take before lunchtime and celebrate it.
That's awesome. I would also add to that, encouraging folks to have a to-do list that breaks those steps down that you can write down. Because I think, as you talked about, you provide the information in your institute in a variety of ways, and people learn differently. Some people are auditory, some people are visual, some people are kinesthetic in how we learn. So we need to apply, a broad, expansive, repetitive model so people can understand things in all the ways in which they might learn. And I happen to be the empiricist. I learn by knocking my head against the wall to realize that there's a door there. But to your point earlier, I recall you just reminded me, there was this time I lived at this corner home in Fremont neighborhood of Seattle, and it had a terraced garden that was totally overgrown. And much like your example of the bike rider up the hill, I looked at that whole thing and I said, no way am I going to be able to do that. So I put it off and put it off and put it off. And then eventually what I did is I said, you know what, I'm not going to worry about the whole thing. I'm going to do this 1 square foot, because I think I could get that done in an hour or whatever it was. And then I realized over time that as each foot went further, that, oh my gosh, I've actually done a lot more than I thought I could. And as you described, motivated me to get all of it done. And it took ultimately probably the same amount of time, but I actually invested the time because I was getting the reward of the progress. So
Exactly. Great example.
yeah, thank you. So thank you so much. How can people get your book, learn more about your work, contact you, anything, all that stuff?
Everything is at innermammalinstitute.org, innermammalinstitute.org. And I have special resources for all the particular needs a person might have.
That's terrific. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's been a wonderful time. I appreciate all the information, your incredible work, and thank you so much for joining me.
Great. It was a pleasure. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, you bet.
Bye.
All right.